Buffering issue, secondary stream here. How about that? So what is Andy playing here, guys? Andy is playing a game. It's called Crazy Uncle Bob. And you run around trying to show everybody that you're not crazy. And your name is not actually Bob. But everybody is convinced that your name is Bob. So you have to do things to convince them that, hey, your name is not Bob. But they don't believe you. They just keep telling you, no, you're Bob. You were assigned that name on your birthday. And then you're like, no, that was somebody else. And then you have to do things to surprise them. To say, hey, like kind of like a shock factor thing. And they're like, whoa, I did not expect that. But you can't shock them too much. There's a balance there. If you overshock them, they explode. And that's bad, you lose. You have to have it just right where you shock them enough to be like, you know, hey, I find that thought-provoking and insightful, and now I will go home and sleep in my comfortable bed and think about my day today and how I realized that you might not actually be named Bob. And so that is progress. But it takes a long time because you're convincing an entire, you know, culture that you're not Bob. But once you do, once you convince them that you are Bob, or that you're not Bob, you become Tim. And when you become Tim, you actually become Ultimate Tim. Because there's already a Tim in the town. And that's why they're so confused too, because you're like, no, I'm not Bob, I'm Tim. And they're like, we can't have two Tims, that doesn't make any sense in our little world. But because you become Tim, Super Tim that is, they accept it. And they're okay with that. But that's a mistake a lot of new players to this game make. They think that if you just become Tim, you win the game, but actually you lose. Because you didn't say Super Tim. And that's something that a lot of people have really been upset about, but that's hard, you know, we call that hardcore difficulty, because if you're willing to take the risk at the end of the game to possibly, you know, be just Tim and not Super Tim, and then lose, you know, you're really putting yourself out there for you know, a lot of work ahead of you, and then just losing it that fast. But it really makes a lot more interesting, you know, of a playthrough of the game. It's a lot more fun, I think, anyway. And a lot of people seem to really enjoy that difficulty. But, you know, for people that want to play it in the easier difficulty, they call it softcore, then you just automatically get defaulted to Super Tim. And then you don't have to have that decision where you can possibly ruin everything. So, I don't know. I'm not much for it myself. It's just, I don't know. I think it's just too easy. It's kind of boring. There's no real challenge then. But that's just me. You know, I'm not trying to, like, pick on anybody who likes that difficulty. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm really, you know, just, it's different for everybody, you know? And it's good to be understanding of that kind of stuff. I remember one time, Frost, he almost got to Super Tim. And I was like, dude, you're like right there. And he's like, yeah, I'm gonna be Tim. And I was like, no, don't do it, dude, you gotta be Super Tim. And he's like, wait, what? And I was like, dude, Super Tim. You gotta, that's how you win this game. And he's like, really? And I was like, dude, trust me. And he's like, okay, Andy, I'm gonna trust you, but I'm really scared right now. And I was like, don't worry, buddy, I got you, because we're friends for life. And I would ride with you majestically on a unicycle into the sunset. And he's like, well, if you really feel that, you know, strongly about it, then I will go for Super Tim. And he did. And he won. And it took, like, you know, that was like after like a month of work. So I understand the hesitation and the fear, but, you know, he really he really pulled through, which I thought was you know, pretty cool. And now he goes around and he owns biscuits, because that's what you do when you're Super Tim. You own the biscuits. You might say, well, what does owning biscuits really do? And that's the next, like, that's actually going to be in the expansion pack of this game. It's called Super Tim Biscuits Galore, and you need to figure out, hey, what the hell do you do with owning the biscuits? You know, where do they go? Who do they belong to? Where did they come from in the beginning? You know, these are all questions that a lot of people have been asking on the forums. I mean, the forums are just jam-packed full of people like, you know, what do the biscuits do? You know, what do the biscuits do? Where did they come from? How did this happen? And a lot of people are really looking for answers, and we don't actually know. There's a lot of theories. One theory is that the biscuits were summoned by an evil mage many years ago, and that he was angry because he wanted Pop-Tarts for breakfast, but all he had was biscuits. And his wife was like, well, I'm sorry, I didn't go shopping yet, so we're having, you know, biscuits instead of Pop-Tarts. And he was like, no, I am so angry with you now, wife of mine. And so he cast an evil spell, banishing biscuits from his world, and instead they came into our world. And now, well, what you see is a world full of biscuits. And so we're trying to, like, you know, that's one theory anyway. But, you know, this, so many people just, you know, you look into, it's like all this, the small details that really make a story what it is. Because sometimes, you know, like, you pick up lore and you're like, hey, you know, is this really a can of tuna? And you're like, yes, it is. But then you read the back of the can of tuna and you're like, wait a minute, look at the fine print. And it says something like, you know, because Zisk, you know, like, or like chicken bisque, this is good in bisque. You know, it has biscuit in it, so you're like, hey, chicken bisque, because of the bisque. You know, see, two B words right next to each other. That's a hint if you think about it. If you put two and two together, you really have something going on there, and I think that they're subtly trying to tell you something in the lore. But you know, that's only if you really sit down and study it. And again, we don't actually have any confirmation from the developers of the game that any of this is true, but it's really looking like that's what they're leaning towards, so I'm pretty excited about that, and I think a lot of other people are as well. I think I just fell way behind on chat. Super Saiyan! Yeah, Super Saiyan! Yeah, you go Super Saiyan! not that super crap. Nobody goes Super Saiyan, it's Super Saiyan. That's the only way to go Saiyan these days.